We start the day with a Colombian, a Guatemalan, or a piping hot Costa Rican.
And a Danish to go. We drive German, Japanese, German, and we ride Taiwanese.
We watch American movies on Korean tablets.
And struggle with Swedish flat packs. Our heroes hail from Chile, Argentina, Brazil,
and often Belgium.
We eat Chinese, Italian, Indian, and go Dutch. Some of our best friends are Mexican, Siberian, Hungarian,
and French.
Hey.
We live on a wonderful little lump of land in the middle of the sea. But we are not an island. We are part of something far, far bigger.
So there's my little introduction to international trade and access to markets. It's obviously a unit that links back to a lot of the things that we've been talking about previously. And that will be the case as we go forwards. Everything sort of links everything in together. So overall, this specification then starts, this is the whole lot, so globalization and global systems, which is the section that we've done already. And then we move on to international trade and access to markets. And from there, we then move to global governance, the global commons, Antarctica, and finish off with a globalization critique, which we'll kind of, again, be doing all the way through this, thinking about whether or not it's a good or a bad thing. So the specification section that we're looking at then, the detail of that then is that we're going to be looking at global features and trends in the volume and pattern of international trade and investment associated with globalization. We're looking at trading relationships between highly developed economies such as the US and the EU, and also the ones that are emerging rapidly, such as China and India, and then those that are much less developed, such as them in sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, and Latin America. We'll be looking at differential access to markets, so different people, how they access the market in different ways from different countries, different levels of economic development, and look at some of the trading agreements and the impacts on economic well-being, but also society and the standard of living. The nature and role of TNCs, transnational corporations, including their spatial organization, production, linkages, trading and marketing patterns. And then it says, with detailed reference to a specific TNC or specified TNC, we'll be looking at a couple of TNCs. So you've got a bit of balance and looking at the impacts that these different TNCs have on those countries in which you operate. So we do more than one, just to give you a bit more sort of variety when you're discussing in an exam question TNCs. So that's why we do it that way. Next then is about world trade in a food commodity. So we look at one specific food type, and it is food type. It says all manufacturing product. We look at food type, and we'll sort of explore that specific product in a little bit more detail. It'd be coffee. That's the product that we look at. And we'll finally then analyse and assess the geographical consequences of global systems, specifically considering how international trade and access to markets underline impacts on your life, but also on other people across the globe. So there's a consideration of you within this unit and where your place is within the globalization of trade and market. So the first part then is the global features and the trends in volume and pattern of international trade and investment associated with globalization. So we're going to have another little look. This is a slightly different video, but I think you've already found out a little bit about the Silk Road.
A banker in London sends the latest stock info to his colleagues in Hong Kong in less than a second. With a single click, a customer in New York orders electronics made in Beijing, transported across the ocean within days by cargo plane or container ship. The speed and volume at which goods and information move across the world today is unprecedented in history. But global exchange itself is older than we think, reaching back over 2,000 years along a 5,000-mile stretch known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road wasn't actually a single road, but a network of multiple routes that gradually emerged over centuries, connecting to various settlements and to each other, thread by thread. The first agricultural civilizations were isolated places in fertile river valleys, their travel impeded by surrounding geography and fear of the unknown. But as they grew, they found that the arid deserts and steppes on their borders were inhabited not by the demons of folklore, but nomadic tribes on horseback. The Scythians, who ranged from Hungary to Mongolia, had come in contact with the civilizations of Greece, Egypt, India, and China. These encounters were often less than peaceful. But even through raids and warfare, as well as trade and protection of traveling merchants in exchange for tariffs, the nomads began to spread goods, ideas, and technologies between cultures with no direct contact. One of the most important strands of this growing web was the Persian Royal Road, completed by Darius I in the 5th century BCE. Stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Tigris River to the Aegean Sea, its regular relay points allowed goods and messages to travel in nearly 1/10 the time it would take a single traveler. With Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia and expansion into Central Asia through capturing cities like Samarkand and establishing new ones like Alexandria Eshat, the network of Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Indian culture and trade extended farther east than ever before, laying the foundations for a bridge between China and the West. This was realized in the 2nd century BCE when an ambassador named Shang Qian, sent to negotiate with nomads in the West, returned to the Han Emperor with tales of sophisticated civilizations, prosperous trade, and exotic goods beyond the western borders. Ambassadors and merchants were sent towards Persia and India to trade silk and jade for horses and cotton, along with armies to secure their passage. Eastern and western routes gradually linked together into an integrated system spanning Eurasia, enabling cultural and commercial exchange farther than ever before. Chinese goods made their way to Rome, causing an outflow of gold that led to a ban on silk, while Roman glassware was highly prized in China. Military expeditions in Central Asia also saw encounters between Chinese and Roman soldiers, possibly even transmitting crossbow technology to the Western world. Demand for exotic and foreign goods and the profits they brought kept the strands of the Silk Road intact, even as the Roman Empire disintegrated and Chinese dynasties rose and fell. Even Mongolian hordes, known for pillage and plunder, actively protected the trade routes rather than disrupting them. But along with commodities, these routes also enabled the movement of traditions, innovations, ideologies, and languages. Originating in India, Buddhism migrated to China and Japan to become the dominant religion there. Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula into South Asia, blending with native beliefs and leading to new faiths like Sikhism. And gunpowder made its way from China to the Middle East, forging the futures of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. In a way, the Silk Road's success led to its own demise as new maritime technologies like the magnetic compass found their way to Europe, making long land routes obsolete. Meanwhile, the collapse of Mongol rule was followed by China's withdrawal from international trade. But even though the old routes and networks did not last, they had changed the world forever, and there was no going back. Europeans seeking new maritime routes to the riches they knew awaited in East Asia led to the age of exploration and expansion into Africa and the Americas. Today, global interconnectedness shapes our lives like never before. Canadian shoppers buy T-shirts made in Bangladesh, Japanese audiences watch British television shows, and Tunisians use American software to launch a revolution. The impact of globalization on culture and economy is indisputable, but whatever its benefits and drawbacks, it is far from a new phenomenon. And though the mountains, deserts, and oceans that once separated us are now circumvented through supersonic vehicles, cross-continental communication cables, and signals beamed through space rather than caravans traveling for months, none of it would have been possible without the pioneering cultures whose efforts created the Silk Road, history's first World Wide Web.
Okay, so the Silk Road then was not globalization exactly, because it was a sort of singular route or a singular group of routes linking a few places together. It was kind of the beginning of global collaboration between countries, between kingdoms, where we were sharing over wide distances rather than just with our neighbours. And that was kind of where the sort of key, that sort of idea sort of began. The key drivers then in the globalisation of trade have been transport and communication. The goods that we want to trade between countries have to be moved, have to be transported, but people have to know about the goods to want them. So you don't just transport something nobody knows about, nobody wants. You have to transport that information, that sort of advert almost, and then people say, oh yes, that's something I want. So communication, then followed by transport, are kind of the key things that have made trade a sort of global entity. The Industrial Revolution then occurs in sort of 1800s, I guess, and the improvements in transport technology meant that all continents of the world began to be linked together, excluding Antarctica, I suppose. So trade and communication, not necessarily equally or fairly, but they were all linked together because we were able to move around the world so much faster and with so much more goods and so on being carried on ships and also on railways as well. So there was just this closing the gap between the countries in terms of their sort of physical space. You were able to get places much more quickly, as we've discussed before in that concept of the shrinking world. What we then have seen, and perhaps we're going through another period of this at the moment for the past few years, is a deglobalization. And I think it could be argued that globalization sort of led to the world wars that we had, the first and second. They didn't necessarily directly cause, it wasn't because of globalization, but they changed it. Instead of it being a war, which we'd had previously between empires, between countries, instead, the first time we ever used the word world war, so a global war. Okay, so we wouldn't have had a world war without globalization. And what then happened is during the war and after the war as well, to some extent, there was a sort of period of deglobalization taking place. People shut themselves off. Obviously, they were trying to protect themselves. And a number of countries really shut themselves off quite significantly, becoming very protectionist, very insular, not wanting to have anything to do with even their closest neighbours, as a result of having been fighting against them or having that sort of battles going on around the world. So there was we've been through periods of deglobalization, and over the past few years, with some of Donald Trump's sort of policy ideas and so on, the US has also sort of appeared to be sort of maybe stepping back from globalization a little bit, and becoming slightly more, insular and protectionist. And we may see at the end of, certainly during, but at the end of this crisis that we're facing in the world at the moment, that the same thing happens, that there'll be a small period of time, or maybe an extended period of time, where countries are much more protectionist, and we see less of the globalization that we've been experiencing for the past 200 years. So after the Second World War then, there was a sort of resurfacing of globalization. So it was a slightly different response to the Second World War at the end of it. And basically what happened is that all the different countries involved, or lots of the different countries involved, they got together and they started to communicate, and they basically created some of the organizations which you may recognize, or should recognize in today's sort of globalized world. These key organizations, they came out of the end of the Second World War, because basically everyone said, that's never going to happen again. What are we going to do to prevent it? And these were sort of some of the things that were created. So the United Nations was created after the Second World War. The International Monetary Fund was set up after the Second World War to sort of sort out paying for how we were going to sort of fund all the recovery and the rebuilding. Okay, the World Bank was set up to sort of lend money to people who needed it to recover from the Second World War. And then an organization called the GATT which is now defunct and is now what is known as the World Trade Organization, also was created so that the different countries involved could trade between each other and share goods and so on. Again, as a result of not as a result of, but as a way of kind of create stability and safety in the world. Rather than sort of, we'd had World War One, not that long later, World War Two, and I think a lot of people were very concerned that we were going to be, 10 years later, we were going to be back in World War Three. So they wanted to stop that from happening, and these organisations kind of were a way of doing that. And also a way of exerting power. We talked about power. They were also a way of exerting power from the winning side in World War II over other countries. So, I don't want to sort of be too sort of, these were things that were brilliant and they were all perfect. There were issues and some people had real complaints about them. But essentially that's the sort of background behind them. So, what happened then after this is that the world entered a period of relative stability, and conflict again became isolated and was between individual nations rather than large groups of nations. It certainly didn't prevent wars from happening, but we didn't see those wars escalating into global conflict. Instead, they became local conflict. Although people might get involved and support, there wasn't that case of it sort of growing and developing from a starting point that was quite small and then getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which is what happened with the two world wars. Instead, it stayed within those nations, and instead the rest of the world kind of kept it contained. And so stability, you've got stability in the world. Everyone knows what they're doing. They're stable. They're happy. They know what's happening. They're not concerned about war, and it led to an increase in trade in all parts of the world. Excuse me. Since 1980, there's a really good fact to try and lock down and remember. Is since 1980, world trade has increased at twice the rate that world production has increased. Okay, so what that means is that we're making more stuff, but it's not that we're making more stuff that's increased so dramatically. It's the fact that we're selling that stuff to other countries and we're trading with each other. So it's not that we're suddenly making loads more things, although we are, but it's more, at twice the rate, that we're selling stuff to everybody else and obviously buying stuff from everybody else. So it's a world trade, and the selling of stuff across the world has really been the big thing that's happened since 1980, quite dramatically.